Hello, everyone, and nice to see you. We will continue with Ivar Paulsson's lectures in religious studies today. And our special guest for this year is Professor Catharina Raudvere from the University of Copenhagen. And today's topic is claims of religious authority and legitimacy, spaces for knowledge production. The lecture will be about 1 hour, and afterwards we are going to have time for questions and discussion as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Helen. And thank you very much for yesterday and the interesting questions I received. They made me actually change the second part of today's presentation because there were some things that I really would like to emphasize thanks to your good questions. And the one thing is that when I sort of emphasized at several points this difference between public space, semi-public space, and the private, this should, and visibility, this should not be understood that these kinds of devotional activities, that they are secret or not known of, or something that people want to hide. Quite the opposite. People are proud of them. But visibility is that when people, or rather in my case, women, take upon themselves ritual responsibilities, they step out. They are visible in a sense, not only as pious women, women who follow regulations and obligations. They are also taking a more active role, not only in organizing prayers and recitations, but also in the teaching aspects. So I would like to emphasize this furthermore in today's lecture. I also got this question about gender. Are the ritual activities that I discussed yesterday, is it only for women, or do men also practice them? And my answer was yes. And hence, I would like to emphasize that in the second part of my lecture, which connects to the third thing I would like to emphasize after yesterday's questions, and that is how people relate to history. Not only the long Ottoman history, that is of course awfully important, that is the source of these both texts and rituals, but also to the history of the 20th century. And more about that later on. So thank you very much for these inspiring questions. This slide was shown yesterday too, and these are sort of the four broader themes that I think can be connected to what I would like to discuss with you and talk to you about, that are not connected to any particular empirical material, but sort of broadly in the study of religion, and especially the study of religion today. But I would also like to claim even for historical discussions. And we discussed the rituals and the ritual practices to some extent yesterday. That will, of course, be a theme throughout all three of the lectures. I think today we will focus mainly on the second and the third, that is religion and politics, and religious community and formal religious authorities. Because as I said yesterday, even though you work with very much of a grassroots materials, you know, in terms of scale and perspective, let's say how the state organizes religion in a particular state is not out of interest, but really important, and how I will show you later. So we have this difficulty to define any define activities on any private public scale. This is more a matter, from my point of view, of visibility and, as I said, the readiness to move, this sense of being prepared to changes, perhaps having a religious argumentation that this is continuation, but in practice, being capable and ready to change in relation to big changes. This work has also been about identifying interpretive domains, where I think, especially in religious studies, there are some, let's say, rather conventional views that a religion has holy scriptures and communities, etc., and the interpretation is sort of the task of certain well-educated, often men. My work has been very much of both how I have identified interpretive domains, where I perhaps from the beginning didn't expect to find them, but have found them. And also how active persons today, these active readers that we discussed yesterday, new kinds of readers, they also identify spaces, domains, resources in tradition that they can use for their interpretations. I also underlined conventionalism rather than conservatism, and I think that's an important point, and also the sharing of ritual responsibilities. So what we will move on today is also the entanglement of religion and cultural history, and especially, as in the case of Bosnia, in a multi-religious society. In a society where multi-religious, multi-ethnical coexistence have been problematic, not only because of the disruption of the Yugoslav Federation, but also actually in history. And where the spaces for verbalizing these interpretations are important, and this sense of being a keeper. That was the point of yesterday's talk about seeing and being seen, about being visible. So it's a question about, to be more general, it's about sites and time. Finding the right sites, the right spaces, being an accepted user of these sites, identifying them as own, having some kind of ownership to them, but also constructing them, creating them in a way that other participants also feel welcome. In the case of these women, that this is a proper place, this is a place where you can trust people and the teaching. So, and of course, the time for doing so. The time for doing so has, for the women that I have studied, been a question of both, let's say, when local mosques are used, not being in apparent competition with the regular 5 days prayers, when the mosque is mostly used by men, but perhaps using the time slots between the midday prayer and the afternoon prayer, when the space is, so to speak, free, when the room is possible to use for other kinds of activities. So there are different agents, there are different voices, and the group that I tried to identify yesterday, they are not exclusive in that sense, they are not odd in that sense or particular. They are one of many, let's say, informal networks that comes together for prayers. So taken together, we can see different agents that have different agendas, that also, of course, have different theological voices in their interpretations. And I think it's really important also to underline that even if studying a small group, it's important to underline variation within the group. Variation within a group is not necessarily the same thing as conflicts or tensions. It's just that there are a variation of objectives, why organizing, why attending. And actually that this also rather puts let's say, a more attractive character to this fabric of variation. That this is a group that don't demand sort of one line on religious stance or concrete problems, etc., or the way using the genres. But as I said yesterday, this of course indicates flexibility, as I said yesterday, a large portion of freedom, both in choosing to attend, but also how to organize. And this is important to indicate for several reasons, because this is really the, let's say, that's the pulse of this group, that these activities take place with this kind of variation. But it doesn't mean that they are completely independent of or parallel with the official religious authorities. In this case, the so-called, or the Islamic community of Bosnia. But I think this goes for what we discussed in the Q&As yesterday, that this is something that we can identify in most religions today, with these new readers, these new active readers. They could be new in the sense that they are dominated by women, or young people, or educated people, or people that, for one reason, have not been at the center of interpretation before. So that is a matter which I think is very important in religious studies generally. It's a matter of scale. Because if we have some collective sins as researchers of religion, I think one of them is that sometimes we blur different scales. We go from a macro discussion to a more grassroots or micro discussion, and the other way around. And I think it's important to see what are the dynamics, both locally at grassroots level and in relation to the state, that is the governance of the state, but also with these authorities, the religious authorities that are authorities in the double sense of the word. They are both the administrative organization, but they also have the authority to have a say on what's the line of, in this example, Bosnian Islam. So we discussed timelines briefly, and you, Helen, asked me afterwards about the timelines and the various differences. And I think we mostly discussed the long Ottoman period yesterday, which is, of course, absolutely crucial to the way in which Bosnian Muslims perform their religion. It's so very much related to Ottoman history, to the long Turkish traditions. And to situate, and this is not only historical details, you will understand why I emphasize this, that pre-World War I would say that the state that is nowadays Bosnia and Herzegovina, by the time of World War I, they were, so to speak, at the crossroad between three empires. There was the Ottoman Empire, there was the Austro-Hungarian, and of course the Russian Empire with its relation to the Orthodox Serbs in the area. Empires that also declined with World War I. This had consequences also for how religion was lived in the mid-war period. And of course, there is authoritarianism in the whole region between the wars, which is of interest in the sense that these authoritarian regimes also made use of ethno-religious identities. This was an important part of various discourses of including, excluding, sort of defending actual nation states or potential nation states. And of course, we talked a little bit about the Yugoslav period in the Socialist Federation, the war, and the post-war situation, and the consequences of the Dayton Peace Agreement. That, which must be remembered, it put an end to a horrible war, but it also split what is the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina today, with its construction in 10 different cantons, which makes it very difficult for a small country to organize, for example, higher education. which we can think about in an environment like this. All of these factors are actually of importance when discussing this Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this has its root in the late 19th century, when the region was under Austrian or Austro-Hungarian rule, because with the Ottomans leaving the region and the region being sort of included in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it meant, of course, that from that empire's point of view, it was important to cut the links with Istanbul, Constantinople. That the Muslims that lived under Austro-Hungarian rule were also to form their own institutions, not be dependent of religious authorities in Istanbul, Constantinople. So in 1882, this Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina was inaugurated. And actually, if we go back to this slide, it has continued to be the authority in this double sense during all these changes. So it has been a body that represents continuity, but of course also governance, what is identified as a particular Bosnian Islam. And the interesting thing with this administration is that it defines itself as the religious authority for all Bosnian Muslims in Bosnia and abroad. Which also, of course, today with huge diaspora communities means that this is a body that by itself defines itself as the highest authority for Bosnian Muslims, also outside Bosnia itself. Yesterday, I just briefly hinted that this might have similarities with the Diyanet in Turkey, which you are perhaps more familiar with all its activities both inside Turkey, how to govern Islam in Turkey, but also in diaspora communities. So there are similarities between these organizations, but also great differences. One of the similarities is that mosques, public mosques, as well as employed imams, are actually the employees of the Islamic community. It also means that it's very difficult to organize activities, let's say formal activities, in terms of organizing communities, groups, or interest organizations that in one way or the other mentions Muslim or Islam without a de facto acceptance of the Islamic community. It doesn't mean that we in the Scandinavian way have to fill in forms and send in, but that every imam also feels like he is sort of in charge of the Muslim activities in his community. And there cannot be competing bodies with this Islamic community. This has had consequences for various Sufi groups. And this is also a matter of whether you are a public organization or not, whether you can register yourself as some kind of organization. You wouldn't have or for example, as a foundation, if it is something that goes in clinch with the Islamic community. The present Reis and Grand Mufti of Bosnia, he has been in office since 2012. And is, of course, a man who is very much aware of the fact that the authority that he is the head of is in charge of Muslim activities inside the country, but very much so also in diaspora. And also aware of the fact that there are many Muslim communities outside Bosnia that are loyal, in regular contact with the Islamic community. But there are also other groups that not necessarily find themselves as in opposition of the Islamic community. It's just that they form prayer groups, small-scale communities that is run, out from the local context, so to speak. Which means that the women's activities that I presented partly yesterday is in one way or the other accepted by the Islamic community, not in terms of documents or stamps, but since they sometimes use local mosques, their activities are known of, since they are visible, since they are navigating in this semi-public sphere, they also have this relation to the Islamic community. And for a group like that, not only them, but also similar groups, is also a question about how you relate to this highest authority in terms of theological interpretations, ways you perform rituals, etc. So one could say that the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina it has many roles. I mean, it's really manifold in this sense, and of importance in terms of both governance, guidance, forming structure, indicating continuity, especially after the war, also indicating something that, irrespective of world wars, authoritarianism, the Socialist Federation, the war, they have been there. They have, of course, changed over time, but the basic body of administration has been there. So it is administrative. It's about organizing the activities in various parishes, etc., building and conserving mosques, etc., hiring the imams and other people connected to a specific local mosque. It's all about producing theology. That is interpreting, producing proper textbooks to be used when the mosques arrange courses and classes for children and grown-ups as well. It's a theology that I would say both, of course, has had a really large challenge to sort of navigating in the influences from abroad, being more radical groups, being liberal ideas, keeping up some kind of, let's say, mainstream theology that sort of is indicating the Bosnian way of Islam. It is also in control of or sets the limits of religious practices, what is proper to practice in one of the mosques, for example. Who will get permission from the local imam to organize something in that mosque? It's not a control in the terms of a checklist, but I would say it's a matter of trust that local imams are aware of what can be done in this mosque, who can preach there. There cannot be radical imams, for example. There cannot be rituals that this body thinks of as improper, etc. It's, of course, also very much a question of representing. The Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina also represents the Muslims of Bosnia. For example, it could be in relation to other Muslim countries. It could be in Islamic cooperation bodies, etc. It could also be when Muslims are invited, for example, to the World Council of Churches, where they have been frequent visitors, also indicating that they are European Muslims. Muslims that are part of European history, and hence also representing not only the country, but also ways of being Muslim in a European context. And as I said before, the diaspora, which is nowadays a large community. It's not only those who fled the country during the war, it's also their children. It's all these activities that now for 30 years have been practiced in the US, in Canada, in Europe, etc. And when studying these influences, I think it's really important to see how influences, ideas, projects, prints, social media, it goes in both directions. It's not only the Islamic community controlling the diaspora communities or the diaspora communities coming with new ideas because they organize Muslim life away from the home country. It goes in both directions. So I would say that the position of the Islamic community is to be counted in. Diaspora communities as well as other forms of transnational contacts that are not necessarily global in a strict sense, but they are transnational. And therefore also perhaps we should underline the contacts between Bosnia and Turkey in terms of Muslim activities. The war, that is sort of a repeated theme. We came back to it even after the discussion yesterday, that the war is present. It is a theme that individuals relate to, family history relates to, the very cityscape of the city of Sarajevo relates to, and also the fact that there have been several attempts, I would even say many attempts, of reconciliation. How to heal these wounds among people who live in the country today. And sadly, many of them have also failed. This has not been an easy task. It was a gruesome war. There were so many conflicts. There were also conflicts that came from before the war. And this has not been really possible to reconciliate, although there have been many attempts. There have been, and this is not really the theme, this is something that we could talk about for 2 lectures, and that is influence from conservative and radical groups. And I wrote outside, inside Bosnia, because it's not only that this is a massive impact from outside, it's also Bosnian who have gone to Islamic universities abroad, lived abroad in Arab-speaking countries, and there's not only the conflict between, oh, they are coming with, and it's so difficult when it comes to religion. Should we use the phrase conservative or radical, or is it at all possible to put in that kind of an axis? But of course, aid that came during and after the war often came also with new ideas that were emphasized. Arabic ways of practicing religion, for example. There could be radical ideas, really taking radical standpoints in theology when it comes to theological ideas, political conflicts, for example, and that's a long and complicated story. But also, I would say, a general conservatism. In that sense that conservative groups, for example, in Turkey or from Malaysia or from the Gulf states, had an influence on Islam was practiced in Bosnia. Some Muslim being very much opposed to this, some of them embracing it also. And of course, a wider context of political and economic problems that people have to deal with. And I think this is a question, as I said, about scale, about where do we identify, where are the influences coming from, how are they adapted in a local environment, but not being blind to that even very local activities with a limited community that is not interested in any missionary activities. It's about being open to receiving guests, but not necessarily to spread any ideas. They are still affected by the larger structure of how Islamic activities, but also theology, is governed in the country today. And I would like to take some concrete examples of this. And this is where sort of I added some other examples than I thought from the beginning, in order also to show that the discussions about heritage, about being a Bosnian Muslim, is also something that engages people that are not necessarily practicing, that this is something that is shared. So when the women in the group that I have studied emphasize themselves as keepers of traditions, that they do it very much by means of practicing in various ways. But if we, and this is also very much the following a Sarajevan history. It's about the city of Sarajevo, where some, let's say, particular traditions have developed. As I said yesterday, even before the Ottoman conquest, there were Ottoman tradesmen coming to the Balkans region. Many of them were Sufis, because as member of a Sufi order, they could easily build networks when they were trading outside the empire too, and as much as within the empire. So therefore we have, or rather had, a building that really represented the very earliest Ottoman history in Sarajevo. It was the Piety, that was a meeting place for the so-called whirling dervishes, those who turn, and you have all seen the very particular rituals that they are engaged in. And it has had its name from the man who supposedly founded Sarajevo. Of course, he didn't found it in that sense. It was a settlement before that, but he founded what was a really urban fabric structure that made Sarajevo to the hub of Ottoman activities in that part of the Balkans. So this man, Isabeg Ishakovic, was a military man, and the tekke, the meeting place for these dervishes, sort of had his name in order to represent the very first phases of this history. This building stood, of course, reconstructed, expanded, etc. But basically, from the midst of the 15th century up until 1957, when it was deconstructed or sort of torn down by the Tito regime. And this was a significant moment in the anti-religious politics in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you know that during the Yugoslav period, the repression against religion, it went up and down. There were periods when it was more easy to practice religion, either Christianity, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, or being a Muslim, and times of more repression. And in 1952, all Sufi orders in the Yugoslav Federation were closed. Of course, affecting mostly Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, but they were closed, definitely. 5 years later, this so symbolic building in Sarajevo was torn down. And of course, as a marking of that, now there is a new history, and let's forget about the Ottoman past and the dominance of religion in the Ottoman Empire. The interesting thing with this spot is that nothing was built immediately on it, because this really indicates the power of a place. Everybody in Sarajevo, being practicing any religion or being Christian or Muslim, they knew that this place was not only the meeting place of dervishes, it was also the beginning of the history of this city that is ours. So it was very much part of a memory, and it was just park, let's say a space, an empty space. But of course, there is no empty spaces. Even if there are no buildings on it, there are memories connected to it. So it was a place that was talked of, identified, and also respected. What happened after the breakdown of the Yugoslav Federation is, of course, with a new liberal economy, that somebody bought this space and wanted to build a gas station. And I know when I was here before, I showed this gas station to your students, and I thought, well, now they think that this woman is crazy. Why is she showing a picture of a gas station? But this is a significant place because you cannot pass it in Sarajevo with a Sarajevo friend without being pinched in the arm and sort of look at this place. What do you see? Oh, gas station. Yeah, but do you know what this place is? This is the place where the Mobilization used to be in the old days. So the gas station is also symbolic of yet another time where money speaks, with a new form of society. And it was really a big controversy when the plans for this gas station were sort of made public. And that was also, and I think this is also why, not only that this is an important historical place, it was also an uproar among people in Sarajevo against these plans. And just before the war broke out in '92, there were big demonstrations. And some people have said to me, you know, this was the last time where people really went together as Sarajevans and protested to protect their history, to protect the history of the city. And they did this together. Then we had the war, and this was this enormous split in society. So there were attempts to protect even the empty space that was so full of meaning. So here I have a nice drawing of what it looked, you know, around 1930. This little 3D model down here is very interesting because that is made by students at the Faculty of Technology at the University of Sarajevo. So this is not forgotten. This story is really carried on where Sufism and that kind of practices that we discussed yesterday are really at the center, but it's still also part of our history. So even at the technical faculty, some students tried to make this 3D model out of drawings, pictures. The difficult thing was to reconstruct or deconstruct the interiors of this building. But this is how it has also lived on until today, even in the education of engineers. And this connects to a book that you can easily find on the internet by Emin Lelic, who wrote this already in 2006. He's an historian, and he is now lecturing at Salisbury University, as far as I know. And then he published very much, not both as an historian, but also as a man with a strong connection to this Sufi identity of the city of Sarajevo. This book that he called Reading Rumi in Sarajevo, the Mevlevi tradition in the Balkans. So picking up how important these Mevlevi dervishes have been with their turning and their ceremonies, their specific way of organizing themselves, but also connecting it to something that we touched upon yesterday, the many languages used in these activities. Not only Bosnian, Ottoman, Turkish, and Arabic, also Persian. And how this Persian poet, I had some very active students last semester who even celebrated Rumi 750 years with poetry reading in Danish, of course, of this poet. But with this book, Emin Lelic also wanted to emphasize and show people outside Bosnia that this has been a living tradition. Where some of the particularities of Bosnian Islam can be found. That is reading the poems in Persian, having them translated by a Sufi master or another learned man often, and then, of course, also interpreted. What does this old poetry mean for people today? And this is a more or less unbroken tradition in Sarajevo. Also in other cities in Bosnia, must be said, but quite a bit an urban tradition. And I think this reminds us of that. This is, of course, the importance of the dervishes and the dervishes' practices, these repetitive prayers that I mentioned yesterday, other special ways of praying, but also, even if people are not practicing, not even Muslims, this is also part of the Bosnian history. And here comes something that I would like to show to you, if it works, which is also, of course, something that is always connected to Sufis, and that is that they are, let's say, by a foreign gaze, by visitor, often regarded as something very exotic, something very special, something that we can go way back in travel writing from the Balkans or the Muslim world, centuries. What do the travel writers write about when they meet Muslims? Yeah, dervishes, of course, especially the whirling ones. So this is also a third aspect, of course, of dervishes being so significant for the city of Sarajevo. So this is, and I also wanted to show this to underline that the ritual practices that I mentioned are not only women's traditions. It's very much also the tradition of men, but because of the spatial separation between men and women, of course, they practice in different ways. I just found this more or less by accident on. Actually, it's from Facebook, but it's also on YouTube. So it's an early German documentary. We know that this was filmed on a Thursday, of course, a Thursday night, which is the day for the gatherings of the dervishes, in January in 1937. And it was published, and this is also how they spelled Sarajevo. And this is a film from the so-called howling dervishes, which is the ones that are sometimes made even more exotic than other dervishes, including the turning Mevlevis, the so-called Rufai or Rifai order. It's a clip of 2 minutes, so it's not long, but I think it's really fantastic that German ethnographers came to Sarajevo and found these howling dervishes, made this documentary, and it's still available today, and also spread through Facebook and other social media. Let's see what kind of sound we can get from this. Maybe we can use the computer. The sound is not so important because you will hear the basics of it. But interesting thing is, of course, what is portrayed in the film, that these are dervishes in the dervish costumes with the insignia of being dervishes. But also at one point you can see, because it was, I think there were a couple, but it was a man and a woman, and you can see the woman anthropologist sitting there on a chair with her notebook in her hand, taking notes, which I think is a situation we cannot imagine today, but it's still there, and it was made for a German audience. So let's see here. Do you think we will have the sound? We will use the computer? And you see this repetition with the words that I mentioned yesterday. You see her? You can also see the mix of costumes. That is dervishes from different orders coming together to pray. And you can see the environment of a Sufi meeting place. I'll tell you more about this later. So you could see how they were forming the circles, the repetition, the paying respect according to the hierarchies among the people who met. They came from various orders. It was not exclusively one order. The importance of the different garments indicating what status you have in this group. Those who were, as we said yesterday, participant, I mean, being part of the ritual, but not having any specific sort of duty during the ceremony, wearing, of course, the simpler garment. And if I would compare this, and I promise tomorrow I will show some few minutes from the women's gatherings from today in Bosnia, that you could see have some basic structures that are the similar. For example, forming the circle. That one could think that is practical. We often sit in circles around the seminary table. It's a way of being able to listen to each other, but it's of course also to forming the unity. How people in charge of a ritual, men here, women in the case tomorrow, how they indicate the shifts of the elements of the prayer, that it's so obvious that there is one person who make small signs and the rest of the group follow on this. The singing, that could be recitation by one particular person for the others to listen to take in, to enjoy, but also the singing of songs that could have stanzas and verses by those who master the whole repertoire, but with the repetitive choruses that other people could follow. So many political, economic, structural things have changed since the late 30s until today, but there are also core elements that you would see in one way or the other repeated in Sufi groups, I would say all over the Muslim world today. This to indicate both male engagement, the similarity of the activities, the blend of people who could attend, but also rituals like this still being important in telling a particular local history about a building that once stood where there was an empty lot, now a gas station, but still so full of meaning. I would like to end with presenting 3 male figures, also in order to show that these are activities among both men and women that relate both to the Mevlevi tradition about reading Rumi in Sarajevo, as Lelic indicated with the title of his book. People who also represent what we discussed after the discussion yesterday, and that is, let's say, the links between the Yugoslav period and contemporary times, because these three male teachers, readers of Rumi. They have all passed away, but they are held still in very high respect. Their memory is commemorated with special ceremonies, and they also represent, let's say, these ritual and performative and interpretive genres that we discussed yesterday. I will start with the only one that I have actually met, and that is Said Effendi Strik. And I would say that the three men that I will present here, they share many things that they have in common. They come from religious families. They are well acquainted with Ottoman history, the Ottoman way of practicing Islam. They have Islamic education. They were well known among practicing Muslims also in the Yugoslav time, perhaps not known at all among people who didn't practice Islam. But they had very different public personas, the way that they communicated with their followers and the wider Muslim public. Said Strik was the most, let's say, the most less visible in public life. He was an Islamic teacher. He was reading Rumi to his followers. He interpreted Rumi. He was definitely in that line, but he had one special thing that interests me a lot. That is that he was very much engaged in these song traditions that I mentioned yesterday. These hymns that forms an essential part both of dervish activities, but also among the women that I have studied. So to him, the songs were just not an alternative to prayers. They were full of meaning, and he could also, by transmitting these songs, he took them, the texts, and the melodies and the rhythms and the choruses as a point of departure for his teaching. His teaching very often took the point of departure in commenting on, discussing these songs with his followers. And as you can see on the color picture, that he was often teaching in, let's say, a very informal environment. In this case, it is a small mosque, but still it's not something that is grand scale. It's quite private, even though in a small mosque, this small mosque is still active in the sort of in the tradition of Said Strik. And you can also see that his followers also took notes. And this is actually from the Yugoslav era, writing in, having the notes, writing them out on computer, and which is also a very important form in the Yugoslav era, how religious teaching was transmitted. And that is the same way as there was in the Soviet Union, the samizdat literature, that you copied. You'd copied things and you could share it with trusted friends. And of course, these collections from his teaching, from his way of teaching the songs themselves in terms of music, etc., of course, are very precious to the people that used to be his followers and that are still active in this mosque. He wears the insignia of a Sufi order, where he had a leading position. He is a Sufi master to be followed, but you can see he is very much playing this down by rather simple clothing and a simple environment, focusing on the teaching as such. And I would say a man that there are still a lot of narratives around him and the singing with his group of followers. He is, although he has been dead since 2010, he is very much alive. Some people with, let's say, Sufi interests in Sarajevo, they know of him, they know of his teaching. Another character, Feyzullah Hajibaric, he died already in 1990. He was much more of a public persona. As you can see, he is wearing his turban. He is teaching in a more elaborate environment, and he took very clear, let's say, public positions in matters that related to the Sufi tradition of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was the man, together with other people that he cooperated with, and this links back to the Islamic community, that after World War II was an organization, of course, heavily dependent of Belgrade and Tito's politics, etc. And the Sufi orders were not included in the Islamic communities. In the Islamic community, they were groups on the margins. Everybody knew that they existed. They were formally closed down in 1952. They were still active in private environments. There were still teachers like the ones that we see here that both transmitted Sufi teachings in terms of theology, but also in terms of practice. This was something that you knew of because you heard from someone. It was a matter of trust. Who can we tell about these meetings, for example? They were not in the 50s performed in a mosque. But by bringing together the different Sufi orders in the Yugoslav period, he made the Islamic community recognize them as part of the Islamic community. And this is not only a formality. This was done, I think, in 1989. I mean, it was really towards the end of the Yugoslav period. And by recognizing the Sufi orders, of course, they could be more visible, but it was also something that was broader. It was something that was outside only those interested in Sufi rituals. It was a way of recognizing the importance of Sufi orders and Sufi practices for Bosnian Islam as an active part of it. Because being excluded from the Islamic community with this particular mosque being torn down in 1957, of course, it was a way of marking, both from the side of politicians and from the religious authority, that the Sufi tradition was not really counted in, but now it was part of Muslim tradition. Haji Baydrić was also a keen reader of Rumi. He had these followers that came to him, sometimes in more private circles, sometimes in Sufi meeting places or in mosques, where he read in Persian, he translated, and he was also teaching on the basis of this. So this is what I meant with interpreting not only the Holy Scriptures, but also interpreting tradition that we talked about yesterday. He also had a keen follower in this man, Halid Haji Mulic, that lived until 2011. Although I never met him, I think he was quite ill during his last years. He was also a very humble man. He wanted to be known not necessarily as a Sufi sheikh or a Sufi master or teacher. He was a hafiz. He was a person who knew the Quran by heart. He thought that was the way he wanted to define himself. And he is very much one of those teachers from the old Yugoslav days that is hailed, that is respected, that is commemorated in various rituals. And as you can see, his grave outside a mosque in Sarajevo is a place where people come to say a prayer for him, perhaps read a verse from Rumi, keeping his memory alive. And I think it's very symptomatic that the mosque, as you perhaps can see here, is a very recently erected one, because this was one of the mosques that the Austro-Hungarians tore down. So it was not only the Yugoslav regime that tore down Sufi meeting places and mosques, it was also done by the Austro-Hungarians. So this is an important site for the followers that still follow in his footsteps, so to speak. We can see a photo here from the old days. You can also see that this is more of a private environment. This has less of the official status, but you can see that his followers, who also took notes, who also wrote them down on typewriters, they are publishing his teachings based on Rumi in Bosnian. And it's spread, it's popular. There are a lot of followers who never had the possibility to meet Haji Mulic in person, but they still have a relation to him as a Sufi master. And this is just a clip from I think from YouTube by, let's say, the communities that come together. They read Rumi. They also read Haji Mulic interpretations of Rumi. And I would say here you see a good example of that it's not only women. It's absolutely not a secret. This is published on, I think this is from YouTube. So hence, this is where I began. And I'm just 3 minutes over time now, saying that no, this is something that engages both men and women, that are very much attached to the Sufi traditions of Bosnia, of Sarajevo specifically, who also relate to tradition, both in terms of doing what is mandatory for a Muslim, like praying and fasting, the teachings of the Islamic community, but still want to approach, let's say, in this case, Sufi traditions by means of a teacher that is now passed away, but a small community carries this on. As the women I have studied, and that we will talk more about tomorrow, and also have a small clip of their way of practicing it, that is in no way a secret, in no way hidden, but a tradition that perhaps, let's say, not so practicing Muslims would say that this is something they respect, this is something they really appreciate. They are happy that people take upon themselves to carry this tradition further on. But I would say it's only a small group that really come together and read Rumi, or like these women have commemorative ceremonies or do the Zikir together like that. So thank you for today.
Thank you for the lecture. And now we will have some time for questions, comments. Maybe I will start myself today. You mentioned a lot today and also yesterday about Ottoman, Turkish, Ottoman legacy, Ottoman mosques, etc. And I was wondering how much Ottoman styles or Ottoman type of being religious publicly and personally have sort of come back to Bosnia and the Balkans, and also the question of taking down the mosques and tekkes, which is really interesting for me because instead of tearing them down here, they were converted into different buildings like sports halls, not the mosques, but churches, I mean. Do they have also different examples there, like not tearing down the mosques, tekkes, converting them to different facilities, using them as buildings in different ways? So yeah, the Ottoman legacy and the buildings.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Starting with the Ottoman legacy, that is definitely really important. I would put it like this. I don't think that it is coming back or because I think when a person today refer to Ottoman history, practices, way of living, for example, it is something that is constructed in our time. It is thought of as coming back or being a continuity, but it is basically also built on the living conditions that we have today. So let's say a neo-Ottomanism that we have clearly in Turkey in terms of both popular culture, state policies, cultural policies in Turkey today. It's not so. It's not existent to the same extent in Turkey today, because there are also mixed feelings about the Turkish heritage, and also perhaps more of wanting to emphasize the Bosnian part of this. Although referring to the Ottoman period as a golden age in terms of art, literature, music, architecture, for example. So it's something very double. I think it would be easier to say that Neo-Ottomanism is definitely a trend and has been for the last 15, 20 years, and even more in Turkey. Not to the same extent in Bosnia today. But still, it is a very, let's say, it's a very forceful argument in theological, religious discussions to refer to this as a tradition that is carried on from Ottoman times. But I think the emphasis is more also look at the history, but we have continued. There is a continuity among Bosnian Muslims that have carried on this for such a long time. And to my knowledge, I tried to find an example of making use of a mosque to something. I wouldn't be surprised if there are examples of that, but I think that, for example, in the Soviet Union, it was more common to use a church for completely different purposes. What I've heard is more that mosques and Sufi meeting places were torn down, destructed. Yeah.
Thank you. I have actually a question about the video of these howling dervishes, and I noticed that it was 1939.
Yeah.
So the context is Nazi Germany, when it was Germans who filmed them. So I was really wondering, because it was a totalitarian context, and the academic community was also subject to the doctrine or the ideology of Nazism. Was there some kind of special interest in Bosnian Muslims or Sufism by so it's kind of a question that
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, there is, in the context of Nazism and Nazi, let's say, cultural policies, I mean, that there is this interest in what is esoteric. I suppose you're hinting at that. I think that they saw, I wish Yle was here. I think they saw this as folklore, as interesting, and I think they would rather be followers in these travel writers that always have mentioned the dervishes. And I promised you you saw that he one of the dervishes took a stick. And these howling dervishes, the Rufais, they are known to when they are praying, and they have prayed for a long time, they are so focused in their prayers that if you have the correct training, you can take this, it's a shashlik stick more or less, and put it through your chins. And that has of course been a favorite theme for travel writers, as well as those coming with this modern equipment, the film camera, to show. Although the clip I have here stops before he does this. But if you look on YouTube today, you can see these ceremonies frequently. And they are not necessarily posted by dervishes themselves, more people having this exotic view of what Sufism can be.
Yeah, thank you very much. You said, you told the story about how the whole Sarajevo came together to protest against building a gas station instead of Sufi prayer house. And probably that included Muslims and Serbs and Croats and secular Yugoslavians. So there was kind of a mass protest or a political stance. So, but do Sufis or these Sufi communities, do they have any public ambition or stance or political kind of stance? You know, for example, do they have any specific approach to peace? And you talked about reconciliation after the war and how it's not has been going well. So do they work somehow towards this in their small communities? Do they contemplate about that? Is that something that's in their agenda somehow, in their faith life? Is it connected somehow or not?
Oh, thanks a lot. Yet other interesting and several questions. I would say I don't think that we can say that all Sarajevans went out for this demonstration, because the person that I've been speaking about this with said that already, I mean, this was really just before the war started. You could see how there were Serb constructions, in the mountains above the city. So I mean, there was also a sense that people knew what was possibly coming, but were definitely so that there were Serbs, Croats and Muslims, and also people who stated no religion, that came together as Sarajevans. I mean, it was about belonging to the city, and that this was this empty space, empty since '57, was also a protest against, let's say, the Yugoslav regime's wishes and various actions to erase parts of history, that there was only this modern history. And I think this was a way of showing that we are rooted in this city. And then the war started, and there was this terrible siege of the city. I think I mentioned this, no, it was after the discussion after the discussions yesterday, that those Serbs who stayed on in Sarajevo, having the sense that this is our city, this is a city for both Serbs, Croats and Muslims, they were even harder targeted by the Serbs who attacked the city when they sort of conquered certain parts of it. Are Sufis visible, let's say, in public politics? That was the way I understood you. Well, this goes back to these ambitions to recognize Sufi orders as a part of the Islamic community. That was done, by the end of the 80s, and by tradition and how they organized themselves and the various branches under the Islamic community. That was, let's say, the historical orders of Sarajevo and Bosnia, but very much also with a focus on the ones in Sarajevo, which was, of course, some kind of vitalization for these communities. They could be more public, they could claim and reclaim various meeting places, etc. By the time when we are thinking about late 80s, the 90s, not only the war in former Yugoslavia, but also if we think of the development within Sufi orders, that among the Naqshbandi orders, there are several orders under one heading. We had these new Sufi sheikhs that were more global, that are sometimes called the Neo-Sufis. I'm not really keen on that term, but they they were and they are Sufi sheikhs that sort of connect with people, get followers in, let's say, by new modes than the traditional orders. They are often global. They are they early on communicated over social media, etc. And there have been a few very successful ones in Bosnia, and they have definitively been more of public personas than the traditional orders. But I would not say, not specifically engaged in reconciliation. Not that there is any public, united Sufi stand on this, because the reconciliation is such a complex history, because to some people, irrespective of religious belonging or if they have a religion at all, that what is reconciliation? Should we forget this history? I mean, it's interpreted in that way too, while other people, religious or not, are trying to see various possibilities to some kind of cooperation, but certainly not appreciated by all. And I think that we can see it on Ireland, we can see it in South Africa, which perhaps have been even perhaps more successful, but still not a success story in Bosnia, I'm afraid.
Any other questions?
It was partly answered by your answer to him, but I have a two-part question. The first part is very, very straightforward and simple. If they know enough about the building you talked about in the beginning that they can even make models of it, have they considered rebuilding it? And secondly, when you mentioned that all these Sufi orders are, there were attempts to make it seem as part of the I don't know, mainstream or the main community. Well, it's 35 years since. Has that become the reality these days? Are these Sufi orders the part of the Muslim community mainstream nowadays, or what's that? And also in relation to that, how much do you see them in public media, big TV station shows or anything?
Yeah. Firstly, well, it has been rebuilt by the Turks. So it has been a Turkish project. And since there is a gas station on the former empty, before that, built space, there is rather close by, but not really, really close. I don't know to what extent this has been a success as a huge meeting place, but still you could see that there were Turkish interest, Turkish aid, helping out with this, and of course Turkish Mevlevi dervish is active in this process. So there is some kind of, well, attempted as a reconstruction, some would say a new construction, if we should be really careful with the words. But I think it was very much done from outside. It didn't come bottom up. I would say the important thing with recognizing the Sufi orders was to recognizing that side of Muslim Bosnian history. I would say that some Sufi sheikhs individually, more as personas, could take place in media, whereas I think the Sufi orders in general have their activities. They know that they are of attraction, people seeking them out for spiritual matters because of historical interest. Some of them, young people who want to train in music, that you can go there to play the ney flute, to learn the hymns like Said Strick also tried to transmit among his followers. So I think it's also a chosen strategy not to be public. At the same time, there are personalities that are public as Sufi sheikhs. But it points to a fundamental, not necessarily problem, but by including the Sufi orders in the Islamic community, yes, recognition, but also, in a way, two hierarchies. Who is the most, who is the authority that I follow in my life, so to speak? Is it the Sufi sheikh, or is it the Islamic community in the theological sense of this body? So, I mean, there are tensions. There are tensions, and there are also tensions, of course, between the Sufi orders. So, a complex story.
No more questions. Thank you very much, Catharina Raudvere, for this lecture, and we will continue tomorrow, because tomorrow we have the third and the last lecture with you, and we will wait you all back here tomorrow at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.